Jaret, nice to meet you. Great. Oh, thank you.
Learned a lot of much. The mystery of metamorphosis is no longer a mystery. It's just a mystery to us. It's okay to turn the lights down as well.
Oh, of course.
But you're not having any notes.
No.
They see better.
I don't ever like talking with them or anything like that. I'm organic speaker.
We have one lady, we do the great women in history, and she reads,
Oh, that stuff.
and then she moves someplace.
Yeah.
So her slides get all mixed up, and it's
Oh.
like.
It's kind of brutal. So sorry. Yeah. Just, I've never done that. I don't like memorizing talks. I just, for just like say what good or bad.
Ready to get started? Well, it's not quite.
Okay. Yes, I'm good. Rolling in.
I thought this room was warm.
It is pretty warm.
It's warm behind the podium, let me tell you, it feels like a fireplace. Can't hear you. You went to the 90s?
Yeah.
You don't, you remember, Frank Mead? My mom worked there for a while.
Yeah, I started grad school in that's after they built the new meteorology building. So I probably could have run it. I started. It's always hard, with colleagues, you want somebody at the university because it's like, no, I don't, unfortunately, because it's so big. It's like you're so insular. And it's just looks so challenging.
There's a clock back there, so.
Yes.
I see it's time.
Okay.
Oh, right then.
I wonder how people are going to be able to read, like kids going to read it. I want to let a trip to Mexico.
Good afternoon. Welcome. I guess we'll get started. And remember, if you have a cell phone with you, if you can silence it, please, that would be great. For those on Zoom, if you would please stay muted. At the end, if you have questions, you can put it in the chat, and I'll monitor the chat, and we can ask the speaker the questions. Phyllis is going to introduce our speaker for today.
Hi, thanks for coming, and everybody on Zoom as well, everybody in the room. They're still coming in. I'm very pleased today to have Dr. Jaret Daniels give us a talk on the reproduction of Lepidoptera, which are butterflies and moths. And that also includes, well, moths. Butterflies we love, moths not so much. How these animals reproduce and uniquely metamorphose from caterpillars to chrysalis to fragile flyers seems a mystery to most of us. Jaret is a curator of Lepidoptera at the Florida Museum of Natural History, McGuire Center, and also a professor in the IFAS Department of Entomology and Nematology. He and his team at the Daniels Lab have worked for over 2 decades to advance the conservation and recovery of imperiled butterflies through research, public outreach, habitat restoration, and captive breeding and reintroduction. Dr. Daniels received his Ph.D. in entomology from UF and a BS in biology from St. John's University in Minnesota, as well as 50 frequently cited technical publications. He has published many popular lay-oriented books and field guides, and he is a noted wildlife photographer. So please welcome Dr. Daniels.
Thank you, Phyllis. Welcome, everybody. It's always a pleasure to be here. I've spoken several times here at Oak Hammock and really love the venue. And so today, Phyllis kind of gave me this title when she invited me to speak. And I will say that I'm really an insect ecologist and conservation biologist. I'm not a developmental biologist or evolutionary biologist. So I decided to take kind of the broader view on this topic. So what I'm going to really do is give a little introduction about biodiversity and insect decline, because I like to kind of ground everybody in the reality of what is happening around us, and then take you on what is essentially a virtual field trip through the eyes of a naturalist about butterflies and moths, and talk a little bit about some of the unique features, behaviors, intricacies, just elements of what makes this one of the most fascinating animal groups on the planet. So, not to lead off with a big downer here, but we all know, of course, that globally biodiversity loss is accelerating. And this is a graph from a recent report called the Living Planet Report in 2024. And it shows that there's been a really significant decline, 73% decline of tracked species. So these are species that are globally tracked by biologists, scientists. They're all vertebrates. None of these are invertebrate species, no insects represented here, but it gives us sobering context to kind of showing biodiversity loss. And there are many, many reports like this from the UN and others showing this catastrophic loss of biodiversity around us. And it is regionally based, so if you're in North America, the decline isn't so severe or so acute, it's 39%. If you're in Latin America and the Caribbean, it's pretty catastrophic, 95% decline, and many systems are sort of close to or approaching tipping points where there really is a point of no return for some of these systems. So we're living in a very fragile world, a very fragile time when it comes to biodiversity loss around us, and insects, of course, are not immune to that. And there's numerous emerging studies, a lot of media reporting on insect decline, including some, fairly sensational headlines like the insect apocalypses here, which was on the cover of the New York Times, several years ago. So there is some alarmism when it comes to some of this reporting, but what we do know is that insect decline is real. It's happening. It's well documented, particularly in well-studied groups like Lepidoptera, butterflies and moths, and larger bees. And why might that be the case? Well, those are two very large insect groups that have been historically really well studied. One of the challenges with insects is that they are hyper diverse, and we don't know much about the majority of insects on this planet. So we just don't have the baseline data to look at decline over time without really looking at well-studied groups. So it is a sobering picture, and it is challenging to deal with. And it's particularly important because, as I mentioned, insects and really other arthropods, they make up the foundation of virtually every terrestrial system on this planet. They're a hyper-diverse group of animals. They're hyper-abundant. The estimates right now, conservatively, when all species are described, is that we'll end up with about 5.5 million species of insects. That could easily balloon to closer to 12 or 15 or even 20 million with some estimates. But again, it's really a hyper-diverse order. And I love this last little bullet point factoid, because this is something that you would most likely encounter with a NOVA show on the cosmos with that many zeros, but at any given time, there are 10 quintillion insects alive on this planet. So it shows
the importance, the diversity, the abundance of this really rich and deep insect order, insect group. And we also know, of course, that insects provide really essential foundational ecosystem services such as pollination, natural pest control, nutrient cycling, food for wildlife, and the list goes on and on. So the reality is that insects, are something not to be vilified, but something that need to be protected because they have really high ecological importance. They're critical to maintaining the functionality of systems that we as humans rely on, whether it be wild systems, agricultural systems. Pretty much insects drive the planet when it comes to that. And we of course know that you can tie all of this, all these services, whether it's the natural world, whether it's insect services, to the economy, right? And so if you just look at globally with the services that nature as a whole provide, that's conservatively estimated to be almost $60 trillion annually. So it's a significant benefit, a significant driver of our global economy of the services that nature provide. If you look at insects and just at one service such as pollination, it's hundreds of billions of dollars a year globally for the roles that insects play in pollinating wild plants, agricultural plants, providing food security, providing jobs, driving our economy. And you could argue too that all of these services are inherent to national security or global security because famine is a driver of destabilization of countries. So when we look at insects all around us and the functionality of the world, we rely on those services so critically. And so they're really that safety net of services that are being provided, and a really good argument for why they need to be conserved. And kind of the last slide on that side of the story is something I've really been harping with my lab and in doing public talks, and that is kind of two sides to this. So one is that graphic that says death by 1,000 cuts. It's by a colleague of ours, Dave Wagner, who's a renowned entomologist, and it shows that while we could easily identify off the top of our mind probably a couple of key drivers for biodiversity loss, like habitat loss and degradation, climate change, it's a much more complex picture out there. It's all these other drivers or stressors, everything from pollution, overuse of insecticides, nitrification, as well as those large drivers interacting together to really kind of erode the foundation of biodiversity around us. And so you could take this as a super big downer, like this is kind of devastating. It's kind of not something you want to think about, but I'm going to turn it on its head and saying this is an opportunity. It's an opportunity from the fact that we're throwing the kitchen sink at the natural world and it's still, surviving. It's still, rebounding. It doesn't take a lot from Mother Nature to have an impact. And we have to look increasingly at these spaces, the spaces that are not the large conservation lands, because we know we're losing biodiversity despite having large conservation lands, national parks, other conserved lands. So we have to increasingly rely on landscapes that we as humans see every day, and that we manage those landscapes more effectively for biodiversity and insect conservation. Everything from farmscapes to utility and energy and transportation rights away to the spaces that we live in and around every day, yards and neighborhoods in an increasingly urbanized world. And we have a role to play in diversifying those landscapes, conserving those landscapes, and creating spaces where humans and wildlife can increasingly coexist, because there's so many benefits to that future world that we know about. So that's my little soapbox kind of introduction to biodiversity decline. And I just wanted to say that because it does sort of lead into everything else I'm going to say, because as you start taking the tour with me of the natural world and the insects around us, they're fascinating and we want to conserve them, and we all have a role to play in doing that. So if you've been out in the yard, you've been out in, here at Oak Hammock, growing up, you've seen this regularly. You've seen the life cycle of butterflies and moths. And I think that's one of the reasons why this is such a charismatic group of animals because they have this almost magical 4-part life cycle. They all start up life as an egg. That egg hatches into a caterpillar, it develops, it eventually forms a chrysalis or a pupa, and then a beautiful, very different looking organism as a winged adult emerges to continue that life cycle. So it's almost this magical transformation that we see right in front of our eyes. And I remember as a child, my grandfather had a silver maple tree, and he would bring over these large caterpillars to me in a coffee can, and they turn out to be Cecropium moth caterpillars, a caterpillar that has a length at maturity of about 6 inches. It looks like a green bratwurst, essentially, is the size of it. It's just, massive and has all these tubercles and ornate structures on it. And I thought it was the neatest thing since sliced bread. I was a kid at 6 years old. This was an amazing thing. It was on his tree, and I reared it up, and it spun a cocoon, and then a beautiful moth emerged. And when I saw that, I was like, I want to be an entomologist. Like, that was just the coolest thing ever. And I've never really turned back. It's that transformational experience that really any scientist has had, either with an individual or an experience that has turned them on to the natural world around me. And I think I'm constantly amazed, even when I walk into my backyard and I see something, I don't take it for granted. It's something really amazing. And there's so many discoveries you can make right in your backyard. And insects are great because they're so understudied and they're so diverse. Like, you can find new species right here in Gainesville, right in your backyard. And that's, what else can you say? You can't do that as a vertebrate biologist. You can't do that as an ornithologist. It's just impossible, but you can do that as an entomologist. So we're going to start out here. So this is a picture of a female zebra longwing. This is my deck on my backyard, and it's a passion vine, which is the host plant for this butterfly. And so she is navigating to that plant to lay an egg. And she does so by taking cues from the environment. So butterflies and moths have large compound eyes, so they're inherently visual creatures. So she's using the morphology of this leaf, the structure and orientation of the plant to kind of navigate towards that plant, thinking, well, it could be a host plant for me. And then as she gets closer, she'll land on the plant. She'll scratch the leaf surface with her feet, with her tarsi, and it'll create little volatiles that come up, little chemical volatiles, and she'll get a chemical cue from those volatiles, and they'll tell her that this is the right plant, I can lay an egg on it, or it's the wrong plant, I need to keep looking. So insects are miraculous when it comes to the senses they use to navigate the natural world, and chemical mediation of those senses is front and paramount. So if she realizes it's the right plant and she lays an egg, like all butterflies do, and you really look at the eggs in the natural world, they're fascinating, right? I mean, you overlook them because they're small and you think, well, God, it's just an egg. But when you look at them up close, they're pretty miraculous. So many butterflies may lay eggs singly, such as this red-spotted purple on the tip of a wild cherry tree. This is kind of a turban-shaped egg of a yucca giant skipper on a leaf of yucca. And this is kind of the pearlized egg of a spicebush swallowtail on the underside of a sassafras leaf. And again, you can see here not only difference in color, difference in structure. Some of these are faceted. Some of these are almost transparent. They're just miraculous. And then some will lay eggs in small clusters. So this is a group of eggs of the Florida white butterfly that are spindle-shaped. These kind of terracotta or orange-red are clusters of the pipevine swallowtail on an Aristolochia vine. These really unique kind of turban-shaped eggs that are both blue or aquamarine and kind of maroon color are laid by the same female, just different color. And they're on the tip of a new growth leaf down in the Florida Keys. And then one of my favorites is this. These are barrel-shaped eggs of the question mark butterfly that are laid one on top of the other. And you can often find these up to 6 or 8 eggs in kind of a tower like that. And so it's fascinating to see these behaviors. And then some are laid in larger clusters. So this is an egg mass of the Phaon crescent butterfly, a small little orange and black butterfly. It's very, very common. I'm sure you have it on the grounds here on the underside of a leaf of one of the best native plant names here in Florida, turkey tangle frog fruit. And then this is a group of egg clusters of the Baltimore checker spot, a butterfly that's found much further up in the Appalachians and the Midwest. And then this is a species we have here in Florida. This is the tawny emperor butterfly on the underside of a hackberry leaf. And what you'll see here is that they're laid kind of one layer on top of the other, but that's not the most interesting thing. If you were to rotate that slide, you'd actually see that they're in the shape of a Mayan pyramid. And that's not the most interesting thing. These eggs were laid by two female butterflies working together. It's the only communal egg-laying species we have in the US. Just, again, fascinating behaviors, and we're just kind of cutting the tip off the development and metamorphosis of butterflies here. And then, of course, you know that all eggs, what do? They hatch very quickly. They hatch into hungry little larvae that do one thing and one thing exceedingly well. They devour your plant material. They're essentially feeding machines. They're like little garbage cans. They pump as much food into them, and because insects have an exoskeleton, they need to molt their skin numerous times as they grow, often revealing a completely different looking larval skin as they do. So they transform not only in size and mass, but often in color and form as they develop. And this happens very quickly for most species, and they consume a massive amount of food. They can increase in mass over 1,000 times. And so this is the equivalent, and I'm paring this down to a really poor analogy here, but you imagine a toddler sitting in his or her room eating pizza and drinking soda, and in 10 days, that little child is the size of a tractor trailer. That is the transformation that this little larva is going through. And of course, this is the egg mass and little young larvae of our state butterfly of Florida, the zebra longwing. And, you know, they come in many different colors, shapes, and forms. This is probably the most common garden butterfly in Eastern North America. This is the black swallowtail here feeding on the umbel of a flowering fennel plant. Some look very different and actually need to protect themselves in different ways. And of course, some might be chemically protected, some might have defensive structures. This one, of course, is often called the orange dog. This is the giant swallowtail caterpillar, and it uses a very different defense. So what does this look like to you? Poop. Yeah, so it looks like bird dropping, right? So it mimics a bird or a lizard dropping, and it actually sits on top of the host leaf in front of God and everybody to advertise that you don't want to eat me, because why would you want to eat your own excrement? So it's a very effective disguise, right? And it's a swallowtail caterpillar. So if you were to touch the back of that caterpillar, it would kind of arch back up, and they have these very fleshy structures called osmeteria, which emit kind of chemical volatiles and very irritating chemical substance that if you're a wasp or an ant and you're trying to molest that caterpillar and make it a meal, it's going to be very irritating to your antennae, to your eyes, and it emits a foul smell that is quite irritating to us as humans as well. And then it's paired here with Schaus's swallowtail, which is our only federally endangered swallowtail butterfly in the US. This is an endemic to Florida, and it has these beautiful pure white osmeteria. So again, just really cool little behaviors that you see, you know, in your landscape, you know, every day, and it's just part of that miracle of metamorphosis as caterpillars exist and develop. Some look really like venomous organisms. So this is a pipevine swallowtail that's mimicking a centipede. And again, it's advertising by this black and red color pattern that it is chemically defended. Some, of course, look like they've had a pretty bad hair day. This is a little metal mark caterpillar on the underside of a thistle plant. And so these hairs not only help it sort of blend into the very hirsute leaf of the thistle, but they're actually quite defensive. And so if you're a parasitic fly or wasp and your goal is to lay an egg on or in that caterpillar as a parasitoid, these long hairs actually prevent an insect really getting easy access to the cuticle, to the body of the organism. So They both serve as both camouflage as well as purely defensive. And then some look almost alien. So this is a great one that we use oftentimes for outreach with children at the Florida Museum because it's semi-transparent. This is the cannel leaf roller or the Brazilian skipper. And you can see, you can see like the dorsal heart, you can see the trachea, you can see internal organs. So it's a really wonderful thing to look under a microscope and talk to children about the biology, the internal morphology of an insect. And the list goes on and on. I mean, I can stand here all day and give you examples of just an amazing diversity of larvae that range in color from green and slug-like to what the heck is this? This is an amazing color, and this would blend into a pea leaf, a pea blossom, and it's just an amazing assortment of diversity and form and function. And I'll just want to mention this guy down here. So this is one of the most unique caterpillars in all of North America. It's from a very limited genus that really only has one representative in North America. It goes by the common name, the harvester. And the unique thing about it is the only carnivorous larva in North America. All other larvae are herbivorous, but this caterpillar feeds entirely on woolly aphids. So females will lay eggs amongst woolly aphid colonies, and then the larva, as it develops, it consumes those woolly aphids, and it will even wear the carcasses of the partially consumed aphids on its back to kind of blend into the rest of the aphid colony. So it's really a fascinating, world out there when it comes to insects. And then some, of course, are heavily ornamented with spines or hairs, and so this looks pretty dangerous. These are actually quite soft to the human touch, but you can imagine if you're a bird or a lizard, this would be a pretty challenging individual to consume. And then some, of course, use camouflage entirely to blend into the environment. This is a southern pearly on the blade of a St. Augustine grass in my backyard. And the head of the caterpillar is actually right here. It has these two little horns on its head capsule, and it has a bifurcated tail down on the end. But if you were walking through your landscape, you'd never notice this, and that's exactly what this caterpillar hopes for. And then some, like the queen butterfly, akin to the monarch, are heavily chemically protected. They have these really unique tubercles or filaments that are on their back. They're ornately colored. They're consuming a milkweed family plant and sequestering those cardenolide chemicals into their body, which render them really acutely toxic to avian predators particularly, and they advertise that toxicity very boldly to the natural world around them. And then there's some that are almost comical. So this is my wife's favorite, I will say. Like she's a saint. She puts up with a lot. I always have critters on my kitchen table or kitchen counter and all that. One little anecdote, and that is, I'm still in the doghouse for this, but one time I brought home a praying mantis egg case, and I told her that it's going to hatch in spring. Don't worry about it. I'll when I get back from the conference, I'll deal with it. So I come home from the conference 3 days later, and I walk in, and she's meeting me at the door, and she has this really scowly look on her face. And she's like, that egg case hatched. There were 200 baby mantises crawling around the kitchen when I woke up. And being the kind of person she is, she had to catch every one of them to release it back out into the environment. But she will never let me live that down. So this is a fascinating little guy. And so he has these amazing false eye spots that you have to really see head on. And you can see the highlight on the eye. You can see the fact that the cuticle actually kind of bows outward. And so it does really look like the head of a snake or a lizard, which is exactly what it's trying to look like. So obviously once larvae develop, and most larvae will go through either 4 to 6 different instars. These are stages of development in which they molt once to a different larval skin. And so that's the typical development for most Lepidopteran larvae. And then, of course, once they get fully developed, they've consumed as much vegetation as they can, they're typically going to crawl off their host plant. They're going to find a safe and secure location to pupate or form a chrysalis or a cocoon if you're a moth, or even some butterflies will spin loose cocoons. And they typically anchor themselves with silk. All Lepidopterus larvae can produce silk. Not all of them anchor themselves or make a cocoon. They may anchor themselves with silk, and in this case, this is a sulfur caterpillar, so it's anchored itself at the base and has a girdle around the middle, and it's kind of hanging there for a little bit, and then it'll molt for the last time into the chrysalis. And this looks, obviously very different from the larva, but it's essentially the larva just in a different form. So it has an exterior cuticle. This is not something constructed, of course, by the larva. It's actually the living, breathing cuticle of the larva. And butterfly pupae come in, again, an ultimate variety of different types of forms. Some are, hang, some are brightly colored, some are cryptic, some are even, ornate with, spines or gold or silver ornamentation. Many are anchored, some are loose. But again, depending on the species, the diversity is almost almost infinite. And then, of course, if you're a moth, for most moths or some butterfly larvae, they will also spin a cocoon or a loose cocoon. And again, all Lepidopterous larvae have the ability to produce silk from silk glands, and they will spin, silk to form, in this case, a cocoon for the Cecropia moth right here that is very durable, very strong, and there's a lot of interest, of course, right now in silk production from an engineering point of view, because it has lots of possible forms and functions depending on the tensile strength of the silk, the functionality of the silk. So engineering and entomology are kind of working together to look at, could different Lepidopterous larvae be useful to everything from medicine to engineering. So, it's a new world out there when it comes to innovation. And of course, as they molt, so this is kind of the traditional view. This is kind of a classic photo from Monarch Watch of a monarch caterpillar hanging. It's starting to molt, the skin is splitting off, and it's going to cast off that old larval skid. And so right here, if you were watching that pupa be wiggling around, and it has a little structure at the base called the cremaster, and it'll kind of wiggle around, do this amazing dance where it'll fling off the larval skin, and the cremaster will kind of come out for a second and then plunge back into the silken button at the base to secure it and hang it for the rest of the adult development. And inside that pupa, even though we often consider this a pretty, let's say, unappealing life stage, something that is very dull and undramatic, is actually the most dramatic life stage, because inside that, of course, the larval structures and everything else is being completely transformed from a worm-like caterpillar into a winged adult organism. And for a long time, this was somewhat of a mystery because we didn't have the ability to peer into the pupa, but with the advent of things like CT scanning, we were really able to look at how development takes place inside and how really functionally it operates and how quickly it actually transforms. So this is a fairly recent paper looking at CT scans, and you can see on the left-hand side, this is day 1, this is day 13. So this is a pretty rapid development. So this is day 1. You can see in red here is like the gut of the larva. Everything in blue is the tracheal system, the air system of the caterpillar. And further on down, like the orange here is the Malpighian tubules. You'll see wing formation here. But two things to take away from is that it's not like the complete reorganization at the cellular level. There are sort of punctual expansions within regions of the pupa where certain transformations take place. So traditionally, this was often thought of, well, the larva breaks down into like milky cellular soup, completely reorganized, and to the structure as adult butterfly. Well, that's not really how things happen. There are sort of epicenters of development. And then the other thing to really gauge, and you can kind of see this with the amount of blue appearing as you go from day 1 to day 13, there is really rapid expansion and development of the tracheal system. It starts really right after pupation and it expands dramatically. So this transformation is fast and it's not, there are epicenters of development within that pupa. And so for most species, within only a few days of pupation, that larva is fully transformed into the structures of an adult butterfly. So this is, day, what is this now, day 16 or something? So here now you see inside the pupa, you see all the structures of an adult butterfly now. You see the compound eyes, you see the proboscis, you see the legs, you see the wings. So it's really amazing transformation in very rapid succession over just a few days, which is, again, one of the most astonishing transformations in the natural world, that you can really, almost experience in your backyard, which is pretty amazing. And then, of course, once the structures of the butterfly are fully formed, it takes in a large breath of air, kind of breaks open that pupal case, and the adult butterfly emerges. It uses hemolymph or blood to plump the veins to the wings to expand them. And if you've watched this happen in your backyard, you know that, this happens very quickly. Within a couple hours of eclosion, that butterfly is fully formed, it's ready to fly away, and it has to be, because this is a very vulnerable life stage. It's very prone to predation. It has to be able to fly and move to, escape any predator in the natural world. So a lot is happening inside that pupa really rapidly. And then, of course, once it's an adult butterfly, the main goal is really sex. The main goal is to find a mate, reproduce, produce the next generation of organisms. So here is a courting pair of zebra longwings. And one of the unique things about our state butterfly has so many unique behaviors, and so I love using it as an example. So this is the pupa of the zebra longwing. I'm sure you've seen this if you've had a passion vine in your yard. Just as an aside, it looks really unique, right? It looks odd. It's craggy, it's very jagged. So essentially, these little silver spots mimic the eye reflectivity of spiders, and these are the legs of the spiders sitting in a web. So it's trying to look, again, like a venomous organism to avoid predation. And if you're in the backyard, you walk outside, you have a passion vine, and there's a pupa on it, you might encounter this. Anybody guess to know what's going on this? Yes. So this pupa in the middle here is a female pupa. The two males on both sides are guarding that pupa, not because they're good guys. They're guarding that pupa because they cannot wait for that female butterfly to emerge. And then once she emerges, it's all out war as who gets to mate with that female. And this is a process called pupal mating, which is kind of unique in the Lepidoptera world. And hopefully this will work. So this is filmed in my backyard. And so the female pupa is being guarded by those two males. Here's another male coming in, and they're expanding their wings. They're trying to prevent that male from landing adjacent to that female pupa because they want first dibs at that freshly emerged female. And I've seen as many as 6 or 8 or more males around a pupa. So it's a dog-eat-dog world out there when it comes to sex and access to it. And then once the female butterfly emerges, even before her wings are fully expanded, that male, that winner, is the one that mates with her. So I'll just say it, like, males, we're not really worth a lot. You know, we have a one-track mind, so it's just it's unfortunate. But going back to that, how that male butterfly locates that female is all chemical. So it's all chemically mediated. So he's going around, obviously he's using his visual cues to find, you know, some general cues in the environment that a pupa might be there, but he's really using his antennae to pick up on chemical cues of the plant and ultimately of the pupa, and then to recognize that inside that pupa with no real cues visually, it's a female pupa, not a male pupa. So it's pretty amazing out there. And so chemical communication is really, you know, paramount in the insect world. And this mediates itself through many, many different ways. So I'm going to segue to a few other examples that are pretty unique. So these are 2 moth species, and they have these pretty miraculous structures like here, and then this is, you know, kind of otherworldly. But what these are are specialized scales called hair pencils that are pheromone producing. So these are used during courtship to, seal the deal when it comes to mating. And these can be extremely elaborate, like these two pictures. And if you come over to the Florida Museum of Natural History and you go through the butterfly rainforest exhibit, you can see that firsthand. So this is a common butterfly we have in that exhibit called the paper kite, or it's a relative of the monarch from Southeast Asia, and it's closely related. So all that subfamily of butterflies have hair pencils. You don't see them normally, but this is a female butterfly flying here, and this is a male courting her from above, and you can see the structures coming out from the tip of his abdomen, that he's wafting those chemical pheromones on her antennae during courtship. And so this is something that you can see firsthand in that exhibit, which is pretty amazing. And then insects also, because of that chemical mediation, use other sources of chemistry in the world to either the precursors of pheromones or for protection from predators. So this is a zebra longwing, and she's feeding on a lantana blossom. And many insects, when they feed on blossoms, they will go to certain blossoms, not only for nectar or pollen, but they'll also go for certain chemicals that they sequester or drink up and then will pass along to the female during copulation that will help her create pheromones or help the male create pheromones, or in some cases, they may actually pass with the packet of sperm chemicals that will provide protection for that female against predators. So it's an incredibly complex world out there when it comes to chemical sequestration and chemical communication. How many of you have all seen puddling behavior of butterflies at damp earth or mud puddles after a storm? So these are, this was taken up in North Carolina. These are male tiger swallowtails, and almost all individuals at a puddle, they're often called puddle clubs, are all males. And they're there for a couple of purposes. They're there, of course, to drink water, but the main goal of why they're there is they're there to get minerals and salts and other nutrients that they will pass on to the female during copulation that'll help improve the quality and fertility of her eggs. And there's good evidence from many studies showing that during courtship, female butterflies have the ability to detect which males have the best nuptial gifts to offer. So it's an all-female choice world out there. Females are driving the courtship, and they select the best males to mate with. And then if we talk a little bit about moths, which, most pheromone producing is kind of iconically related to moths. So this again is a Cecropia moth. This is one of my favorite that I grew up with. And she's sitting on a branch. If you go down on the tip of her abdomen, you see this little structure that's popping out. So she's sitting there, and this would normally be at night, and she is emitting pheromone to attract a male. And that pheromone can travel kilometers away, and individuals can travel miles to find that one female. And so this was a graphic using a silk moth as a generic example. So she's sitting here, she's emitting pheromone, and as it emits out, that plume kind of expands, infinitely outward. And a male moth that might be, let's just say 4 kilometers away, has encountered a molecule of that pheromone. And so he's now understands that somewhere a female is available for him to mate with. And so he will take a circuitous route to ultimately find that female. So he's going to continue to track that plume of pheromones to the point where he's not detecting anything here. He needs to go back to the right, got a lot of pheromone here, nothing, go back to the left. And he'll do that until he eventually winds up at that female to mate with. And if you looked at most moths, and again, insects are horrible when it comes to generalities because they're all across the board, but I'm going to use the generality of a silk moth, like a Polyphemus or a Luna moth that you might see around here. So if you're a female Luna moth, you have antennae that look like this. If you're a male Luna moth, you have antennae that look like this, very broad and ferny, and that's because all this is sensory available material for you to ultimately detect that pheromone. And so if you magnify that antenna, you get these little structures here, which is a lot of surface area for those little molecules to, for you to easily detect that pheromone plume and ultimately find a mate in the future. And then I'm going to end with a couple of quick examples of another unusual behavior. So this is a mating pair of Acrea butterflies. This is a group of kind of old world butterflies that are pretty old in general. And many of them, and this is pretty well represented in certain groups of butterflies, when they mate, after they mate, the males produce a waxy solution that ultimately is affixed to the female abdomen. And here's a structure you can see here. It looks pretty cumbersome to fly around with. This is called a sphagus. And what essentially is, it's a chastity belt. So that male has passed a package of sperm to the female, and he's ensured the fact that only his sperm is ever going to fertilize any egg that that female produced. So no other male can come along afterwards, mate with that female, and have his sperm used to fertilize the eggs of that butterfly. And this is actually a poorly studied area of Lepidoptera, but we had a student at McGuire Center who worked on this. And so this is a plate from one of her publications, just showing some of the diversity of these structures that are left behind by the male after copulation. So it's pretty amazing. And my big takeaway is that it's an incredibly unique, diverse world out there. There are so many different behaviors, so many different elements of biology, ecology, behavior, reproduction in just Lepidoptera to study infinitely. If I had 15,000 lives, I couldn't study it all. So it's just an amazing world out there to study. And with that, I'll just say thank you. I'm happy to answer any questions you have. And thank you for bearing with me with that virtual tour.
What an amazing presentation Jaret gave us. Beautiful slides, all this information. And isn't nature wonderful? So, questions? Oh,
Hi, Mary Chrisman. Thank you. That was wonderful. I love your pictures, especially. A simple question. You showed a picture of the zebra longwings where the old males were swarming, which led to the question in my mind, is the male-female ratio 50-50? Or is there some differences?
Theoretically, it's pretty 50-50, but for most species, they're very protandrous, which means males typically come out ahead of females. And so they're usually maximizing their numbers when females are emerging. Yeah. Let the party go on.
Thanks. I was going to ask the 50-50 question too, but I have another question, which is, I know that there are different ecological niches and so on and so forth. Of course, that's obvious. But my question is there one particular insect or one particular insect group that, if it were eliminated, would cause a cascade effect throughout the environment that would lead to environmental collapse?
Wow, that's a great question. So I'm going to answer that two ways. I'm going to say that because insects are hyper-diverse and hyper-abundant, that as a group, they're so important because they provide so many different types of services. So I'm sure you might have seen the Disney film, I can't think, the Bugs film with Disney, but the Bugs Life, thank you. But they provide decomposition. So without insects, we would be overtaken with excrement and material that wouldn't get easily decomposed. Obviously, pollination is a keystone service. So it's hard to answer that. If I was saying at the moment, what would be most critical in the short term to eliminate, I would say bees. obviously, because they're the most effective and efficient pollinators, and we rely on them so much for food production and our economy. So if you wanted to, you were like an outside country trying to make a critical strike at a group of organisms, that would be a pretty good knockout punch.
We're going to have a lecture next week from a researcher who will talk to us about the most vulnerable insects and the consequences of that vulnerability and what we're doing.
Just wanted to say one further thing real quick, is that, you say, well, $500 billion is how much the pollinators affect the economy. Well, actually, it's priceless, because if you don't have the pollinators,
No,
you don't
definitely.
have the
And it's
food.
hard to quantify that, right? And so those are just kind of woeful estimates. But the point is that if you're callous and say, well, we can live without that, you look at really how many different elements are tied to that service. And I don't want to just say like, it's often saying, the food on our table or the prices. Well, that's a very generic example, but really it's food security. It's national security that's sort of tied to that.
We have a question from chat. What is the best bush or plant to put in a garden to attract butterflies?
Wow, that's almost an impossible question to answer. I have my favorites, but I'm kind of privy to firebush. I like firebush as a hummingbird butterfly attractant. Any of the sort of Coreopsis, black-eyed Susans are really good. The list goes on and on. It's hard to, it is an impossibility to sort of pick the best one. So I would say understand what soil, light, and other environmental conditions you have, and also pick plants that you like. And that's really the best thing. I mean, there's an infinite list of plants almost to sort of select, both native and non-native, that could be quite attractive to insects.
Well, then here's one specific on milkweed. What's the current position on planting tropical milkweed versus native milkweed?
Yeah, so that's a very controversial issue at the moment. So what I will say, like our position at the Florida Museum of Natural History, my lab, is that you should always strive to plant native milkweed, not tropical milkweed. It is a non-native, sort of semi-invasive plant, but it provides many challenges to the monarch. It disrupts the monarch migration. It can, really induce a protozoan parasite infection in, constantly breeding populations. If you go to a big box store, most likely those plants that you buy are laced with pesticide, which render it for a time period unusable by the monarch or even lethal to the monarch. So if you have it in your yard, I'm not saying you should rip it out, but be mindful of when it is best used for the monarch, and that's during the breeding season. So if you have it, cut it back around Halloween. Don't allow it to be vegetative until late February. And then then you can kind of at least mitigate some of the bad things about it.
Yeah, it's hard enough to find tropical on the
It
market.
is, yeah. And
let
it's an ornamental. It's grown as an ornamental, but we are working with Home Depot, and they have tentatively agreed to pause the future production of tropical milkweed for the foreseeable future, and they're looking at alternatives. So, it takes a lot to steer the Queen Mary, but it can happen, and slow and steady wins the race, right?
Yeah. Okay, I'll run back here. Wait.
I just wanted to clarify that Home Depot question. Is that just for local Gainesville? Is that all?
It's all of Florida.
Yahoo.
They've said that. I don't know. So if you go to Home Depot today, you'll still find it. So we have to work with the growers because there's still milkweed in production. So again, they're going to pause the future production of milkweed until that, inventory is depleted.
Pat Harden, Jaret. Two questions. One is, speaking of the big box stores, and people buy most of their plants, but most of them, aren't they treated with the neonics, the neonicotinoids?
So Home Depot and Lowe's made the decision to eliminate neonicotinoids, but and that sounds wonderful, right? I mean, and it's a step forward, but the reality is then growers just go to another systemic insecticide. So, and there's new chemistries coming out all the time. And, ultimately the danger is that plants that are marketed as wildlife benefiting or attracting plants could actually do the opposite, right? They could cause direct harm for a period of time until those chemicals, leach out of that plant. But and we know that a lot of those chemicals not only are in all plant tissues, they're in the pollen, they're in the nectar. So it affects, visiting insects as well as consuming insects to that plant. So we are actually through UF working on a wildlife friendly kind of branding or certificate program to try to work with stores like Home Depot and Lowe's to create a certification process, kind of like proven winners, to actually put some data behind it and work with growers to say, if you're marketing this plant in a big box store or anywhere else as a wildlife attracting plant, the consumer has some guarantees or some assurances that it actually is safe for wildlife and it actually attracts what it's marketed to attract.
Okay. One question kind of off this subject, but any update on the success of the Miami blue reintroduction?
So, so news is not good on that front. So this is a little butterfly that's endemic to Florida. It was described from the greater Miami area, so it has that name. It's federally endangered. We've been working on it for a long time. It kind of, over the last 3 decades, it kind of collapsed north to south, and we had a very active breeding and reintroduction program. Unfortunately, we no longer have a captive population of that butterfly, and we have not been able to find it in the wild for the last 18 months. So news is not good on that front, but on some other species that we're working with, like Schaus's swallowtail, which is, I showed the larva of, it's another federally endangered butterfly, that is going the opposite direction. That is, going, significantly up in numbers and abundance and range, and we're expanding the range of that butterfly. So conservation is challenging, and that butterfly has had many challenges, climate change being one of them. So, yes.
Can I just say,
Sure.
I buy my butterfly plants at the Florida Museum.
Yep. And yeah, we will be having a
Presumably they're
Earth Day plant sale again this year for
Good.
those of you that want to.
While I'm walking back here for her, what is known about the pheromone detection system of male moths that allow detection of such minuscule amounts?
Actually, quite a bit. I'm not, that's a little outside my normal range of expertise, but again, they have, their antennae are designed to pick up, parts per million of those molecules in the environment. So they're incredibly acute at identifying and tracking those pheromones over great distances in many cases. So they're incredibly acute at doing that. I just want to mention one other thing before we go to the next question, and that is, you all know that the Florida Museum is going to be closing for a period of time, the public side. So that will happen at the end of March. However, our last big hurrah event will occur on March the 8th. So if you're able to come over to the Florida Museum for that event, my lab will also be giving out free native pollinator attracting plants, 1 per person. So you can come over and get your plant, have a good time, say temporarily farewell to the brick and mortar side of the museum, but we will be out in the community a lot more over the next 18 months.
I just wanted to ask about the Attila, what the update on that is.
So the Attila, this is the Kunti hairstreak, the one that feeds on cycads, kind of orange and blue or black butterfly. So that is a butterfly that is secure. It's found quite abundantly in many places in Southeast Florida. There are populations now on the West Coast, in Sarasota, Naples. There's even a population up around the greater Orlando area. It's been one that's been moved around a lot by humans, so it kind of exists in unusual places. It's a boom and bust butterfly, so some places you can find huge numbers at certain times, other times it kind of retreats, but it's secure. It's a beautiful butterfly, it's very local, and it's one of the kind of butterflies of conservation concern that is kind of the model for how home landscaping can really help save a species, because it's almost disappeared from all natural lands, and where it occurs predominantly now is backyards, neighborhoods, community gardens, botanical gardens, where cycads are grown as an ornamental.
Thank you very much. Since I have the microphone, I'll ask one last question. In your discussion of pupation, you mentioned that the trachea develop within that period of time. That's how the butterflies, the insects breathe, is through a trachea. What exactly is that, and how do they intake the oxygen
So
or
it's-
the air?
Yeah, it's a good question. So it's a passive system, right? They don't have lungs like us that actually mechanically move air in. So it's just a passive system of diffusion of gas across that membrane. And so, you know, I assume that the trachea rapid development is to really fuel that cell transformation.
Do they exhale?
I mean, it's passive both ways. across
Right.
the trachea.
What do they exhale?
Um,
Carbon dioxide, like we do?
Yeah.
Ah, what do you know? Thank you all so much for coming. Dr. Daniels, great talk.